Okay, great. So you're already here. Welcome.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. How are you all doing?
I am doing very well, thank you. So
Excellent.
we are really excited to start Digital Zone in its 10th year, which is very important for us to have you here finally. So really thank you to join us today. So we are really excited to see your speech and your presentation very much.
hmm
So if you are ready, we can start. If you need just a couple of minutes, we can wait for the exact time of the
No, I'm ready.
11:30.
I'm
Okay,
ready.
great then. Okay, so welcome again, and I am just muting my microphone and closing my cam. If you need any assistance, I will be here. So thank you again.
Excellent. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mehmet. All right. Wonderful. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Martin Splitt. I am a Google Developer Relations Engineer at the Google Search Central team, or the Google Search Relations team in Zurich. I'm coming to you from the heart of Zurich in Switzerland, and I'm really excited to talk a little bit about debugging JavaScript websites. So, before I start talking about JavaScript and why we need to be able to debug websites that are using JavaScript, I would ask you all to tell me if you have a website that uses JavaScript. You can use the chat, you can use the QA. I wonder if I can actually, I can make a poll. So, why not do that? Is your website using JavaScript? And then there's yes, and then there's no. Audience can select start polling. Are you sure you want to post this poll? Yes, I want. So I don't know where in the thing that you are seeing you can see the poll, but feel free to go there and tell me if your website uses JavaScript or not. And besides that, it is very, very important to understand that JavaScript is something that impacts your website's SEO. And why is that? Well, JavaScript today is often used to build websites that basically fetch their content dynamically or show content dynamically based on something. And this something can be all sorts of things. It might make sense if your website really is an application rather than a website, so people can actually do things like uh, browse a document or work with images or even create like 3D artifacts or whatever. If any kind of website is actually more of an application, then JavaScript is surely part of the game, really. So most of the content in that case is actually generated through JavaScript. In the end, it will be mostly HTML that you'll see, but this HTML can change based on JavaScript. And looking at the poll, currently 71% of you say that your website is using JavaScript. I would be not surprised if 29% saying no might actually be using JavaScript as well, just in a capacity that they're not aware of, which is fine. So JavaScript gives us a lot of power that we don't have without JavaScript. So if you think about like what do you need to make a website, you very likely immediately think about HTML. You do need HTML. Without HTML, you can't have a website. And then you need some CSS because you want that to look more interesting than just black text on a white background. So the way to actually accomplish that is to use CSS, and CSS and HTML are very core to what web is. But however, there's a third one that mostly is forgotten in this equation, and that is JavaScript. JavaScript is just as much a core technology for the web as are the other two, HTML and CSS. Why is that? Because neither HTML nor CSS necessarily handle interactions directly. Yes, sure, you can have CSS states that change with things, and you might have certain elements that like the details and the summary elements that allow you to actually have like an accordion kind of thing, and you can have a button. But if you click on the button and you want to make something happen, that is where JavaScript comes in. JavaScript allows you to respond to all sorts of events and then load or change content on the fly. And this ability is actually very, very powerful and very, very important. Why is that important for us as SEOs? Because as far as I can tell, it's all about interactions and it's all about like presenting applications on the web or hosting applications on the web. Well, the thing is, If you are building with JavaScript-focused technologies such as client-side rendered frameworks, that means that you are shipping the minimum HTML, load some JavaScript, and then that JavaScript actually produces the content that you see on the website. So without JavaScript, you see nothing. Is that a problem? Does that mean that Google does not see your content? No, not necessarily. Because what we do is rendering. So here you see this pipeline image. We have a URL, we crawl that URL, we get the HTML back, and then we process that. So what does processing mean here? Well, if there is already some content in there, let's say like a canonical tag or a meta tag, we can already extract it here and use that. If all the content is here, that's great, then we have all the content here, but we don't know if all the content is here. Even though you might already have a bunch of stuff in your HTML, we don't know if that is everything, right? So for that, we then have to queue the website for rendering. Rendering fundamentally means opening it in a Chrome on a server. So we're running a headless browser on the server, and then that headless browser actually executes JavaScript, and then the JavaScript might produce additional content. For instance, if you're using a comment widget or a calendar widget that has additional content on your main page, that might use JavaScript. That content would only be created in rendering. It doesn't matter if it is in the initial HTML or in the rendered HTML. Every website is rendered anyway because we don't know if we don't have additional content coming into the JavaScript on your page. And then that rendered HTML is being used for processing and indexing. So the JavaScript that runs during rendering might produce or change the content on your website, and that content then is used for indexing. The very important thing here is once it is rendered, once it is on the page, it doesn't matter if it was in the original HTML or in the JavaScript, the index doesn't know the difference. The index only knows that's the content on this page. So rendering and JavaScript only are important in between crawling and indexing. Starting from indexing, there is no difference, which means JavaScript directly does not have any impact on ranking either, because once it's in the index, it's fine. It does have indirect input on the ranking, though, because if content behind JavaScript is actually not being rendered for some reason, then that content can't go into the index, and what isn't in the index can't rank. So there you go. So every website is rendered, JavaScript is being executed during rendering, and JavaScript does have the power to change your content. We actually don't care about the HTML that comes in crawled. We basically have to run it through rendering anyways to construct a DOM tree, and that DOM tree is then being used further on. But as with everything, crawling things can go wrong, ranking things can go wrong, as well as rendering things can go wrong. Rendering things, when they go wrong, can be quite nasty to look at. Here, for instance, we have an example of a page showing up in search results with an error occurred. That's not great. That's not something that you want to see in your search results. Normally, we are pretty good at catching these things. In this case, we haven't caught that one. What happened here? Let's have a look. So I go to a website that doesn't exist. In this case, it seems to be fine. As a user going here, I'd be like, oh yeah, so this says, oops, this page does not exist. This clearly is an error page, right? So having made this request in crawling, having gotten this response, I'm pretty sure this is a 404 page. So I don't see what the problem might be, because this looks right to me. Looks like an error page. I go to a page that doesn't exist. I get an error message. I think we're good. I think that's not an issue, right? However, if you look closely, there is a bit of a problem. So when I made that request, I actually don't get an error response back. I get a 200, which means that the server is telling Googlebot, this is a page with content, you're good to go. And then a bunch of JavaScript has to happen to actually load the content. And in this case, it doesn't load any kind of content. It specifically loads the fact that it's an error. So what happens here is this is a client-side rendered application, but it's not necessarily a problem to have a client-side rendered application. The problem here is it's a single-page client-side app that does not handle errors well. It doesn't have to. You can handle this gracefully. This can be fixed. So you can build client-side rendered single-page applications that do not have this problem. This is a soft 404. It's one that we somehow didn't actually see. So we didn't catch this one. But nonetheless, this does not have to happen. Why does it happen? It happens because of a way that developers might not necessarily realize there is a requirement in here. The requirement being that we should send a 404 for an error page. The developer was tasked to show an error page if a non-existing page is shown. They do that. As far as the developer is concerned, the developer has done their job here, no? I mean, it shows an error page when I go to a page that doesn't exist. So yeah, tick the box, moving on. Users see the error. Users won't complain because it seems to be working for them as well. The problem here is that probably there was no SEO involved to actually tell them, but wait, the HTTP status needs to be 404. And even if there was an SEO involved here, they might have been told by the developers, yeah, but we can't do that. And they are right. They can't easily do that. The problem here is that the server has to respond with something, in this case a 200, and the server doesn't know if the page exists or doesn't. It basically just serves the same HTML and the same JavaScript in any case, and then the JavaScript tries to load the content, and then if the content doesn't exist, then it shows an error message. The problem is JavaScript can change pretty much all of the content, but not the headers coming from the server. 200 OK is something that the server has already sent. This cannot be modified. So does that mean that you just have to live with soft 404 errors in a client-side rendered single-page application? No, you absolutely don't. So what you can do instead is you can program the server with a specific URL, let's say like /not-found or /404 or something, where the server knows that it needs to respond with a 404 error HTTP code. If they do that, the JavaScript can then, instead of just showing an error message, can do a redirect. It can say like, oh, this data doesn't exist, this content doesn't exist, this page doesn't exist. Okay, in that case, I make a JavaScript redirect to the page where I know the server will respond with a 404. In that case, Googlebot renders, executes the JavaScript, gets the redirect to the other page, gets a 404, and concludes, aha, the page I tried to render sends me to this other page, so the page that I tried to render is not there or isn't where it used to be, and now I'm getting to this new page. That new page is a 404, so the original page is a 404. There we go. Problem solved. That's the easiest way to solve this. This is not complicated. It's very, very easy to configure your server for a specific URL to respond with a 404 error, and then the JavaScript to make a redirect to that page. Easy. But you have to know that A, this is a problem, so that you actually implement something that solves that problem, and B, that there is a solution that works. So developers might know B, but they might not know A. They're like, if we show the user an error message, what's the problem here? The problem is not with the users, the problem is with search engines or bots. Okay, now we fixed that, and I said like developers usually don't know the requirements well enough when it comes to SEO, which is fine because that's kind of your job to define the requirements and define them clearly. But then they might not know the solution either, and they might not even know what the problem specifically is. So if you are tasked to fix this problem, if you are doing a monitoring of your site and you see these soft 404 errors, what do you do? And not just soft 404 errors, there might be other problems as well. How do you debug them? Well, this should be pretty clear to everybody, but I have found out through meticulous research and talking to a lot of people that a lot of people don't actually know this. The best port of call in this kind of situation are the Google testing tools. Search Console has the live URL test or the URL inspection tool. And if you don't have a verified property because you might be on a staging environment, you can use things such as the rich results test or the mobile friendly test, for which you don't have to verify your property first. And then what you do is you basically just paste the URL in where you have seen a problem. And then you might, for instance, go to the Search Console URL inspection tool and then paste that URL in there. And then you get a screen that tells you a bunch of stuff. In this case, for instance, because it was a soft 404 that we didn't catch, it get indexed. So you can actually see the crawled page. This is very, very useful because the crawled page is what we actually saw when we crawled and indexed. So that means that instead of doing the live test right away, you want to first look at what we looked at or what we saw when we crawled. The live test is using the same infrastructure, it's using the same systems as indexing does, but it has different guarantees. For instance, in indexing, we might use caching to avoid having to refetch all the resources. But the live test should give you like a live view of what is happening right now with your files on your server. So it will skip the cache and try to download everything. The other thing is indexing can take a while. So if indexing says like, please check and like crawl and index this URL, then it might actually have to wait half an hour until the crawler actually crawls. And that's fine. For indexing, it doesn't matter. It basically has like a bunch of jobs and says like, please crawl this URL, this URL, this URL, and then it waits for a URL to come back from crawling. If that takes an hour, fine, doesn't matter. The problem with the live test is we can't have you sit in front of your computer for an hour waiting for something to happen. So we try to get it in whenever there's a little bit of time for the live test to happen. But sometimes that means that some of the crawls time out because we can't wait so long until the crawler actually comes back. So if we're like, can you please download this image, or can you please download this CSS, or can you please download this JavaScript file, the crawler might be like, yeah, I'll do that in half an hour. And then what live test does, it says like, yeah, sorry, we have an other error. So if you see other error, it usually is a timeout on our end that has nothing to do with you or your infrastructure. It's purely a scheduling problem on our end. Anyway, so you might want to start with the, or you should start with the crawled page if available. If you look at the crawled page, a lot of people jump to the screenshot right away. The screenshot is not as helpful as people think it is. It absolutely is not useful because we're not really using the screenshot in rendering or in indexing. We actually care about the rendered HTML. Conveniently, the rendered HTML is available in the HTML tab. So instead of trying to look at the screenshot, you'd rather want to look at the HTML. You can use the little magnifying glass to search for something. So if you know that a piece of content is being injected with JavaScript, you can basically use that search function here to find the piece of HTML that hopefully is there. If you don't find it here, that usually means the rendered HTML does not contain that piece of content. And that is where your problem lies. If the content isn't in the rendered HTML, it means it can't be indexed. If you're not sure why it is missing, you might also go to more info. There you see the HTTP status coming from the server, as well as all the resource crawls that we made. And you could see if we have any HTML, if we have any JavaScript execution issues. You also see JavaScript errors. If you have JavaScript errors, it doesn't matter. Unless this JavaScript error is the reason why something in the content is missing, the JavaScript error itself does not matter. It doesn't get processed. It just gets displayed here for your convenience. So you look at these two things. If you don't have the crawled HTML, you might try a live test. But if the live test fails, it doesn't mean that indexing necessarily fails entirely. It might just mean that you have some sort of timeout issue that is coming from our infrastructure, not from yours. Excuse me. So in this testing approach, excuse me. So in this testing, you want to have a look at the rendered HTML and if the content is in the rendered HTML. If the content is in the rendered HTML and if the JavaScript resources have loaded and the HTTP status is what you expected, then it's likely not a JavaScript issue. So technically, the HTTP 200 was not really a JavaScript issue. It's an architectural issue and more specifically a server configuration problem. It manifested through JavaScript, but it's not really a JavaScript problem. But it looks like one because it is a JavaScript client-side rendered application. So people are like, yeah, this would not have happened if it would be a server-side rendered app. And it's kind of true, but again, that's because then for a server-side rendered app, the server configuration has to be right or it doesn't work. So the fact that it worked was actually thanks to JavaScript. So JavaScript kind of made it working where it wasn't working beforehand. So that tells you something. So if all these things are here, then it's likely not a JavaScript issue. If the JavaScript resources haven't loaded successfully, then that is a problem that you need to investigate. If it's a timeout issue on your end, if the JavaScript is too large, if the JavaScript is incorrectly chunked, if there is some sort of other server error on your end, again, that would more likely hint at a server configuration issue. If the rendered HTML doesn't contain the content, then it is probably a JavaScript issue. So if it's in the rendered HTML, it's unlikely a JavaScript issue. If it's not in the rendered HTML, then there is very likely a JavaScript problem. So what if content is missing in the rendered HTML? Well, as I said, likely a JavaScript problem. But how do I debug that? How do I find out? Well, conveniently, your browser has a lot of really useful tooling that you can use to actually debug problems that you might not necessarily find otherwise. So you can do all sorts of things in your browser. You don't have to install other tools or third-party tools. You can actually do this in your browser. Your browser has different ways of getting into your developer tools. One would be to right-click and say inspect. That takes you to the developer tools. Some have like a menu, like view developer tools or something like that. Depends a little bit on your browser, but the browser developer tools are pretty good in all the browsers these days. Okay, so what can we do? Well, in the browser developer tools, you have the Elements tab, for instance. Sometimes it's called the DOM tab. In there, you see pretty much what would potentially be the rendered HTML. This might not be exactly what is rendered in the Google bot rendering process, because this is, for instance, ignoring robots.txt, because this is not a robot, this is your browser after all, so it doesn't do that. It usually fetches these things with a different user agent. So if the user agent is being sniffed out on the server and it shows like it's a normal Chrome, then it might actually deliver different results than it would be if the user agent would be a bot user agent. But yeah, anyway, you can use that as a preliminary idea to figure out what is happening here. And you can see what's in the DOM. The DOM is represented like HTML. The DOM actually doesn't look like HTML. But here, for us humans to consume it, it looks like HTML again. And here, for instance, I found an image. And I'm like, well, the image is here. So why is the image missing in the rendered HTML? That's a good question. So generally, it's being rendered. I just don't know where it's coming from. And then I can take the URL of that image and have a look at where that is being inserted. I could go to the sources tab, for instance, to see what the server sends in terms of files and data. The sources tab would probably show me if I'm searching the source for this URL, it would not be there. That would be another hint that this is actually coming from JavaScript. But which JavaScript generates it and where is it coming from? I don't know. But conveniently, there is a possibility to look that up in a second. So you want to look in the source HTML, in the source files, to see if it's in there. If it's in there, then surprise, surprise. If it's in the server sent HTML, it's not a JavaScript generation either. So the content is not JavaScript impacted, or at least is not inserted into the DOM via JavaScript. But if it's not in there, then we can go to the network tab. If you go to the network tab and search for that specific URL, for that specific image URL that I've just looked at, we see down here the image is coming from an initiator called main.something.something.js. So that is the file that actually loads the image. And then I can click on that and be taken to the source. In this case, it says line 1. Line 1 usually means that actually I can't really look into it myself, because this is probably a minified file. So everything that made it readable is actually stripped out, and it's like the minimum code so that we don't ship too much code to the users. Impacts performance, makes it faster for users is great. But there is an unminified version of that for your developers. So this is a good opportunity to talk to your developers and find out what the code is that actually loads this file. But this is how you find out where it's coming from. And now you know for sure that this is not in the source HTML. This is absolutely, definitely being loaded through JavaScript. And again, loading something through JavaScript is absolutely okay. That is not a problem. If it works and shows up in the rendered HTML, it's fine. We are looking at this only because it does not show up in the rendered HTML. Why does it not show up in rendered HTML? We don't know, but we know that JavaScript loads it. So for some reason, this piece of code is not being executed when it's run through Googlebot. If you work with your developers on this case, for instance, you might actually find out that this is being executed on scrolling. So the user scrolls, this JavaScript runs and loads this image. That works if you are actually a user and you actually scroll through the page. So this, again, to the developer looks like it's fine. The image is there. I just scroll down here and hey, look at that. The image is right there where I expected it. So that's what we wanted, right? So we're done here. This is not a problem. You found out, ooh, this is not loading in Googlebot. Why is it not loading in Googlebot? That's a question that you can ask your developer. You can now go to your developer and say, like, I noticed that the main JavaScript chunk, for some reason, loads an image and it doesn't load this image in Googlebot. And then the the developer can test the same or basically do the same test with the unmanified file and tell you the piece of code that does it. And there it would be like window.onScroll. And it's like, yeah, okay, fair enough. This is a scroll handler, but Googlebot doesn't scroll or click or anything interactive with the website. It doesn't interact with the website, which means it doesn't actually see this image. And because of that, it can't actually understand that there is an image in the content and cannot rank this image either. So we have figured out what the problem was this way. So what do we do now? Well, what do we know now? Well, we know the content is coming in via JavaScript. Again, that is not a problem per se. It's coming from main.js. Main.js loads it. Again, not a problem. The file is minified, so we don't know when it loads it. Like, what does the code do here? So that's the moment where we need to talk to the developers. And now we have enough information to actually do that. We know it works in the browser. We know it doesn't work in Googlebot. We now know it's the main.js file. They need to have a look at an unminified version and tell us what the problem is. And then we can work that out together. What's next? Well, the developer might not have a public-facing URL for this, right? If you think about it, in mobile-friendly test and all the other testing tools, you do have to upload something into the internet, into the public internet, kind of, right? So you have to actually make sure that you have a publicly accessible URL. But what if this version, this unminified version, only exists in staging, and staging is behind a password? Well, then it doesn't work with mobile-friendly test, for instance. Or even worse, it only exists on the developer's machine. It only exists on the laptop of a developer. Again, you don't have a public URL. Well, actually, you might. You can use local tunnels. There's a project literally called Local Tunnel, or there's another thing called ngrok.io, N-G-R-O-K.io, ngrok.io. These are providing local tunnels. What does that mean? Well, basically, the developer has a local version, basically a web server on their computer that is available only to their computer and the local network. But when they run a tool like Local Tunnel or ngrok, they get a temporary public URL. And that temporary public URL can then be used to actually allow other people to look at it over the internet, so to speak. Well, which means that also things like the mobile-friendly test can access this. So if I am running a server here, then let me see if I can actually do that. I'm actually trying to run something. I don't have anything that creates an mi-g server. I think server exists. I think that's the thing. I can show you how that looks in a second. Give me a moment, because we have enough time anyway, so I might show you what I mean when I say that. Let's see. Okay. Did that do the thing? I think it did the thing. Serve. Yeah, there we go. So I now will show you something in just a second. So I do have a local web server now that shows this page. The problem is this page is currently running on my local machine. It is not available to the public as is. And actually, let me switch to sharing the entire screen real quick, because I think that makes it clearer. So now here you can see this is localhost 3000. So this is only on my local machine. It is not actually available anywhere publicly. But I can make it so by using a tool called ngrok. I can say I want ngrok to be available. Is it port 8000 or 3000? It's port 3000. Okay, good. Good. And now what it does is it basically gave me a publicly accessible URL. So if I take this URL now into a new browser tab and open it, then I get to the same thing, which means that I can now go to the mobile-friendly test, put this URL in, and have a test. So this is testing a website that is coming from my local machine. It does not have a public URL or anything. It's not usable on mobile. I think that is fine. HTML, here's a screenshot, and so on and so forth. So I can use this to test stuff. And this URL is temporary, because the moment I go here and close the tool, this URL is no longer available. If I type in the URL now, it goes, nope, this no longer exists. And that way I can very easily test things out. And I think that's very, very powerful, actually. I think ngrok wants some money now. I think LocalTunnel does not. But this makes debugging with your developers a lot faster, a lot easier, and it helps you actually catching problems while they're being developed rather than having to wait until they're deployed to staging, or even worse, when they're deployed in production. So you can catch these problems earlier as well. And it's not that hard to set this up, and it's not that hard to actually use it. Okay, let's talk about 3 things or 3 overarching themes where things usually go wrong. What are like the top 3 problems with JavaScript that I keep seeing? Well, one is a creative approach to things, right? For instance, you can actually load structured data through JavaScript. That works. That is not a problem. That absolutely is a viable solution to do this. However, if you're being too creative, here the developer was very, very creative in how they do this loading. Again, the loading itself is not the problem. It's just the code does what it wants or what it needs to do or what the developers asked to do if you're running it in your browser, but it does not work well in bots. The way or the reason for this is the way that this is queuing events. The problem here is that it basically takes does a few tricks to actually load the JSON LD into the data. It doesn't show up in the rendered HTML. Again, it's not because JavaScript doesn't work. It's because the way that the developer chose to write the JavaScript here, which works fine in browsers but does not work with bots. You want to be the one who catches these things, so you want to make sure you check that every content that you care for is actually in the rendered HTML using the Google testing tools. Another thing that can go wrong is with invalid markup. Do you see something that looks strange here in this markup? We very clearly see the markup starts in the head. It has like a meta char set. It has a meta viewport. It has an icon, like a fav icon. It has a title. And then the body starts, and there's an iframe, and then a bunch of meta tags, like the canonical tag, the description, the meta robots. All of these things are in the body here. Do you have any idea why that happened? Any possible idea what went wrong here? Well, what went wrong here is that someone embedded a piece of JavaScript, and again, that's not a problem per se. This JavaScript, unfortunately, was living in the head. When the developer of the JavaScript, it's a third-party JavaScript, and the developer of that JavaScript intended it to live in the body. But someone accidentally placed it in the head. What's the problem with that? Well, the problem is that JavaScript injects or creates an iframe. An iframe cannot live in the head. An iframe does not belong in the head. So the browser was nice enough to say, okay, so it's an iframe. It doesn't belong here. So I'll just end the head and start the body where an iframe can live. So everything else in the head that came after that JavaScript file is actually shifted into the body. That shouldn't happen, but it did happen in this case. Unfortunately, that shifts all the meta information below that JavaScript into the body where it is being ignored in this case. So you want to be sure that the markup looks the way that you expect it to look like. And also you want to make sure that you execute JavaScript to see if the JavaScript modifies the markup. In this case, it does modify. So even if you crawl with a tool that doesn't run JavaScript, the head looks fine, but then it looks different in the user's browser and it looks different in Googlebot. Because this is invisible information, it's very hard to spot that visually. The other thing is what happens, and I already gave you examples of that, when requirements aren't clear, right? So the developer was asked, this is a news site, they were asked to see if the browser supports location. So if the browser has the ability to tell you the location of the user. If it does so, then you request the location, and then you load news from their location. So you show them local news. That's great. That's a fantastic feature. If the browser does not have the ability to show location, then you load global news. Still fine. Now, the problem here is, do you know what happens when a website needs location? A little pop-up appears, right? And this pop-up has not just one, but 2 buttons. It doesn't have just like, I agree or accept or allow. It also has a no, I don't allow, I don't accept, I disagree. I don't give my location. So the problem here is this code asks, can the browser ask for location? If yes, get the location. And when we get the location, load local content. If the browser cannot ask for location because it's a really old browser or it's Opera Mini on mobile, which doesn't even have the function, then we load global news. Do you see the gap here? Because there are browsers that can ask for a location, but won't give it to you when the user says no. In that case, where the user says no, this code does nothing. If this was the code that loads all the content on the page, this means if you click no, the browser shows nothing. It's a blank page. And that's not great, is it? And that's exactly what happens here. So the developer does what they are asked to do, but they didn't actually see that there is one thing missing. Because the get current position function has two things. You can say load local content when I get the location and load global content when I don't get the location. But it's missing. What's missing here in the line that says get current position is load local content, comma, load global content when there's an error. It's a small oversight. And it works fine because I'm pretty sure the developer will be like, yeah, sure. And then it actually gets the location and then it actually gets the local content. So the problem here is that the developer overlooked one small use case. And the fact that they overlooked this means that now the page is blank, not just for Googlebot, but also for users who are not giving access to their location. All right. So let's summarize. Why did we go into debugging JavaScript websites? First things first, from the poll that you did, I see that pretty much 72% of you know that they are working with JavaScript websites. 28% say they don't work with JavaScript websites. Good for these 28%. But for the 3/4 of you, or nearly 2/3 of you, you definitely want to keep an eye on JavaScript. JavaScript is pretty much on nearly every website these days. If it loads content, or controls content, or removes content, or is in charge of content, it has impact on SEO. Because content is what is being indexed, and if it's missing because of JavaScript, then that means it's missing in indexing, and that means it's missing in ranking. You can find out if content is missing using the Google testing tools and the browser developer tools. It allows you to figure out where you need help from your developers, and then you can take the information that you gathered from the testing tools to your developers, which allows you to collaborate with them. If they don't know about Local Tunnel or ngrok, that's a fantastic opportunity for them to know these things, because these tools are very, very handy in testing if you want to test against publicly available testing tools. If you want to learn more, we are on Twitter at Google Search C, or I'm personally on Twitter with Geekonaut. We have a YouTube channel at youtube.com/Google Search Central, and developers.google.com/search is all the documentation you could wish for. You can also give us feedback or find the help forums if you want to ask questions more specifically. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I think we have a few questions in the Q&A pool.
Yeah, thank you so much, Martin. Actually, I listened very carefully because Zio's website is also running on JS. And also, actually, Google has really good documentation about this, and it's always an issue while fixing the problems with developers sometimes, because we just focus on SEO more, and developers can generally focus on maybe the performance and the other stuff. So about the engineering part. But I think that presentation is just perfect guide for people and the companies who has a JavaScript website. Thank you very much. And as you see, we have some questions, and most probably we will have some following questions as well. So if you like, I can just ask you the questions.
Sure.
On their behalf there. Yeah.
Sure.
So our first question is, when a URL is inspected on Google Search Console, it says the page has issues with mobile usability. But when I check the same URL on mobile friendly test, it says everything is okay. I wonder which one should I trust? One of the questions is that.
In that case, I would trust the mobile friendly test because it fetches things live, and it's possible that just this style sheet or something has timed out, and that was leading to some confusion in Search Console, or that the problem was intermittent and it has now resolved itself. Always test on mobile and make sure that you are 100% sure that it looks all right and correct. But generally speaking, I would trust the mobile first test more. Unless there are timeouts that are on our infrastructure, then our mobile-friendly test might actually be the one that is wrong.
Okay, great. Thank you. And we have a question from Judith Lewis. Will a browser always end the head if there is accidental JavaScript like that, or will it vary? Is this what will happen? It's something like a search engine that renders.
So just to be very clear, scripts can happen in head, and it's fine, and it won't end the head. JavaScript can very well live in the head. The problem is if the JavaScript creates an iframe and inserts it after itself or before itself, then that would end the head. Not just an iframe, but pretty much like anything. If the JavaScript renders a form while it lives in the head when it was supposed to live in the body, then anything that gets injected into the head that should not be in the head will end the head, not the JavaScript itself.
Okay, great. So actually we have some topics on fire like GPT-3 and AI content in marketing. So before asking the questions, maybe you can just tell us what's your opinion about the AI generated content, because I think it will be more visible in our nearest future. So
yeah,
some people are already really worried about the content, just reading content from written by AI, or on the other hand, if the information is correct, what's the matter who wrote it down? So what's your opinion, and what do you think Google's opinion will be like for the content written by AI?
It's actually quite funny. At another conference in Austria, Bastian Grimm recently did like a test, and he basically presented people with two pieces of content. One was written by the AI, one was written by a human. If you have very badly written content, then honestly, an AI will pretty much steal your job. Because if your content is utter shit, then that's what AIs can already do, and they're cheaper and faster at that. So bad news. But whenever it comes to actually well-written content from subject matter experts, the things that we already rank on, the things that we already support and want to foster in search results, then AIs are not there yet. They can't. It was very clear. So with badly written, so basically he asked a human being with no expertise in the topic to write a text, and the AI to write a text about the same topic. Humans were, like the people in the audience, were not able to distinguish between the AI text and the human text there, because both of them were crap, were really bad. So that's where we are at. But with the text that was written from a subject matter expert, pretty much everyone in the audience knew which one was written from a human, which one was written from a computer. And that's exactly what's going to happen with AI. AI is a tool. I think AI will replace or improve the tool set that people who are writing texts have today. I know how hard it is to write stuff. I'm part of the documentation writing team. Lizzie helps me make my things look better when I write them. But basically, when you write and you have to start from nothing, it's really hard. Editing something that is already there is surprisingly easy. It's very easy to do that, to change a text that exists. And I think it might be a good idea to have the AI generate the first version of a text and then go like, no, all of that is nonsense. And then basically just edit the bits and pieces that are nonsense until you have a text that looks good. So AI is a tool. It's not something that generates content and that you can just put on a website and be happy with, because it is going to be never being, or it won't be producing anything as good as subject matter experts will anytime soon. If your content is replaceable by AI content, then your content is not great. That's all I'm going to say with that.
Yeah. It was a great summary, especially the last sentence. Thank you so much. So there's another question from Melissa. Can a JavaScript use website be easily indexed by Google bots? I think there is no problem anymore, but on your site, maybe you see some cases.
If you're building it well, if you're testing that everything works the way that you intended it to work, then sure, this is absolutely fine.
Okay, great. So if there is another question, we have like 5 more minutes. So before that, some of our attendees are asking, is it possible to see the presentation later? You will be able to share it or not? As far as I
So
know,
the
you won't.
slides I
But
can't share, but if this video is being shared, that's fine.
okay, great. We have some other GPT-3 related questions, but if you'd like to answer it, I think Yiğit also joined the session, our next speaker. So it is a very related question, but maybe you would like to answer. Can we use GPT-3 in tech?
No, I don't see how that would work.
Yeah. I think you saw the question. Okay. I think there is no more question, Martin.
All right. Excellent.
Okay. Thank you really much for your time. And
Thanks a lot
it was
for having me.
a great pleasure to have you here. So I
Great
hope to see you again in another meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a great time. Enjoy the rest of the conference.